Good evening and welcome from Washington, D.C. My name is Colleen Parsons and I direct the Global Irish Studies Initiative at Georgetown University, which is an initiative to support and develop teaching and research about Ireland in comparative context, and to bring this work to a wide, in this case, a very wide audience. I have a pretty simple and a very quick task tonight, which is to offer all of you a very warm welcome to this evening's program, marking 175 years since Frederick Douglass traveled to Ireland on a speaking tour, and reflecting on the significance of that tour for Ireland and for Douglass's later life, as well as for our world today when the Black Lives Matter movement has swept through the world. It also falls to me to thank the many organizations we've worked with to bring you this evening's program. It's been our pleasure to work closely with our principal co-sponsors for this event, the African American Irish Diaspora Network, and our stalwart supporters at the Embassy of Ireland here in DC. The Embassy, as many of you know, is coordinating a whole host of Frederick Douglass related events over the coming months, and you'll see more information about this in the link that's shortly going to be posted in chat. In addition, we've received support from the Irish Network DC, University College Cork, and their own Douglass in Cork program, which promises a really fascinating lineup of events in person and online in February 2021. We've also received support from Glucksman Ireland House of New York University and NYU's DC Dialogues program, along with Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University. And we are always very grateful to our own co-hosts here in Georgetown University, the Department of History, and the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. We have a really packed program for you today, starting in a minute with pre-recorded remarks about the significance of Douglass's journey by Ireland's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, TD. We're really honored that the Minister has taken time out from his extremely packed schedule to acknowledge and launch our program in this way. Following this, you'll hear from the founder of the African American Irish Diaspora Network, Dennis Brownlee, who'll then hand over to Miriam Nyan of NYU and our panelists, Professor Edna Green Medford, Professor Maurice Jackson, and Professor Christine Connealy. I know it's going to be an excellent and an eye-opening discussion, and I feel really lucky that we've been able to snag these scholars to join us tonight. During the discussion, by the way, we will welcome your questions for the panelists, which you can transmit using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then at about 6:05 or so our time, so an hour and 5 minutes from now, we'll have the privilege of being joined live for a very exciting announcement by Minister Simon Coveney, by the Ambassador of Ireland to the US, Daniel Mulhall, and the Chief Executive Officer of the Council on International Educational Exchange, James Pellow. I obviously can't tell you any more about that, but do stick around for it. For now, though, I invite you to sit back, relax, enjoy the program, and we're going to start with these words from Minister Coveney, followed by Dennis Brownlee.
175 years ago, at the meeting in the Conciliation Hall here in Dublin, Frederick Douglass heard Daniel O'Connell speak of liberty. Of their meeting, Douglass would recall, "I have heard many speakers within the last 4 years, speakers of the first order, but I confess I have never heard one by whom I was more completely captivated than by Mr. O'Connell. It seems to me that his voice is enough to calm the most violent passion. There is a sweet persuasiveness in it beyond any I've heard. His power over an audience is perfect." From a man who would himself come to rank amongst America's great orators, it testifies to the electric power of O'Connell's rhetoric. 3 months on from his meeting with O'Connell, as Douglass readied to leave Ireland, he reflected that he had spent some of the happiest moments of his life here and had undergone a transformation. With poignancy, he said, "I find myself not treated as a colour, but as a man, not as a thing, but as a child of the common father of us all." 175 years on from the Great Famine and a period of mass emigration from Ireland, we are now blessed to be a nation drawing immigrants to our shores. As a state and as a people, we are much stronger for that diversity. But we must recognise our limitations too. The past months have given us pause to reflect on whether all who move to Ireland today are as welcome as Frederick Douglass was 175 years ago. We've been challenged to acknowledge and address inequalities within the narrow bounds of our own island. And we must continue to strive for equality and liberty, both at home and abroad. In these pursuits, we draw inspiration from Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell, from the values they embodied and espoused, the causes they championed, and the resilience they showed. On this evening, it's heartening that so many brilliant institutions would come together to reflect on the legacy of these, the greatest of great leaders. As Ireland's Minister for Foreign Affairs, I want to thank Georgetown University, New York University, Quinnipiac University's Great Hunger Institute, and my own alma mater, University College Cork. I want to pay special tribute to Dennis Brownlee and to the African American Irish Diaspora Network he leads, whose work is so very vital, and to Professors Jackson, Connealy, Green Melford, and Nyan for their shared wisdom with us tonight. From Dublin, gur míle maith agaibh go léir.
Good evening. I'm Dennis Brownlee, and I'm the founder and president of the African American Irish Diaspora Network. I'd like to thank Minister Coveney for his very thoughtful remarks this evening. And we are honored that he will be joining us later in the evening with Ambassador Mulhall. The mission of AAIDN is to foster connections between African Americans and Ireland through shared heritage and culture, and to build upon the unique and special bond between these two cultures. We formally launched the network at the beginning of this year, and in addition to this event tonight, we're developing programs in the areas of ancestry, travel, education, and entrepreneurship. I would like to thank all of our participating sponsors in this event, and I offer particular thanks to Georgetown University and Colleen Parsons for hosting it, and Ragnar Almquist at the Embassy of Ireland for all of his assistance. I'd like to recognize our AAIDN board members for their commitment to our mission, and especially Stella O'Leary, who was instrumental in planning this event, Professor Christine Connealy, one of our panelists tonight, who suggested that we schedule it on the anniversary of the date that Frederick Douglass met Daniel O'Connell, and Miriam Nyan for moderating tonight's discussion. I'd also like to welcome our other distinguished panelists, Professor Maurice Jackson and Professor Edna Green Medford, and offer heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists for lending their wisdom and scholarship to this conversation. I'd like to note that Nettie Washington Douglass, Frederick Douglass's great-great-granddaughter, is here with us tonight, and I recognize her for the work that she and her son, Ken Morris, are doing to advance equality and human rights through their Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives organization. Most importantly, I want to thank all of you who are with us here tonight. I invite you to visit our website at aaidnet.org for more information about us, and join us in building this African American Irish community. As we face renewed reckoning on race, culture, and class today, we should all be beckoned by the moral North Star that guided Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell in their quest for freedom, equality, and human rights for all. That is at the core of our discussion tonight, and it is integral to the mission that we seek to advance through AAIDN. And now, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our moderator, Professor Miriam Nyan. She is the Director of Global Irish Studies at New York University and the Associate Director of NYU's Glucksman Ireland House. Her scholarship is focused on Irish history and migration, oral history, and comparative migration. And since the year 2000, Miriam has compiled oral histories of Irish immigrants, and she recently began recording the histories of African Americans who share Irish ancestry. She hosts the weekly This Irish American Life radio hour on public radio station WNYE in New York and online. Miriam, thanks again for hosting our discussion tonight, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I'm just thinking as I listen to you, it's just over a year since you and I met for the first time, and you had an idea of an organization, and I commend you on what you've accomplished over the last year, and I'm privileged to be have played a small role in that network, but thank you for, it shows from a small conversation how these things can develop, and I'm really delighted to see that. Who would have thought this time last year that we'd be here doing this today?
Absolutely. Thank you for all your contributions, Miriam.
My pleasure. Welcome everybody. As everybody, Colleen has mentioned and Dennis has mentioned, I'm actually speaking to you today from NYU, from Luxman Ireland House, and it's my pleasure to be in the company of three amazing scholars with you this evening. I'm going to give some brief introductions, but my introductions, in the interest of time, will not do justice to the breadth of scholarship and the richness of what Edna, Christine and Maurice have done over their careers. And it's a point of personal privilege and professional privilege to be here today to moderate this discussion. And I'll try my best to keep as quiet as I can, which, if you ask my husband, doesn't happen very often. And also, just before we go any further, we didn't know what this event would evolve into or how it would evolve, and it is phenomenal to see so much interest and to see that we have people tuning in from across the Atlantic here this evening. And it became, I think, a much bigger event than Colleen had bargained for, and I thank you. It's a really busy time of year for us academics, and I'm really, really personally grateful for what you've done in executing so far, which sounds like a great event. So I will first begin with Professor Edna Green Medford of Howard University. She's a historian of emancipation in the United States and a recipient of the Order of Lincoln Prize. Her books include Lincoln and Emancipation, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation, Three Views. She compiled and wrote the introductions to the edited 2-volume work, The Price of Freedom, Slavery and Civil War, Volume 1, and The Price of Freedom, Slavery and Civil War, Volume 2. Welcome, Edna, and I look forward to our conversation. Next, we have Professor Christine Connealy. Christine is based at Quinnipiac University. She is an award-winning specialist in 19th century Irish and Irish American history and is the founder of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac. Most recently, she has published Black Abolitionists in Ireland, and she has edited Frederick Douglass in Ireland in his own words. I believe they came out in 2018. Welcome, Christine. Again, a pleasure. I love working with you, and it's a lovely opportunity again this evening. And thank you for all you've done to put Frederick Douglass in Ireland on the scholarly map for us. Last but not least, Professor Maurice Jackson. Maurice is based at Georgetown University. He's a renowned expert of African American and Atlantic history, and also in the history and culture of African Americans, with a special interest in jazz. He is the author of Let This Voice Be Heard, Anthony Benzay, Father of Atlantic Abolitionism, co-edited with Jackie Bacon of African Americans and the Haitian Revolution, and co-editor with Susan Kozel of Quakers and Their Allies in the Abolitionist Cause, 1754 to 1808. So we've planned a rather informal discussion this evening, folks, and I think the first question I'm going to kick off is a little bit, why are we all here? What are we talking about in terms of Frederick Douglass and Ireland 175 years ago? And I'm throwing that first question out to Christine. Why and how was Frederick Douglass to find himself in Ireland in 1845? Would you mind just contextualizing it a little bit for us, Christine?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you to all the organisers and the sponsors. I think it's really great that we're here tonight on this important anniversary. So I'm sure most of you know Frederick Douglass was born into enslavement in 1818. He never in his lifetime knew his precise date or year of birth. We now know it was 1818. As a young boy, he inadvertently was taught his ABC, and he realized very early on that education would be his pathway to freedom, and he knew that he could not remain in enslavement. So as a young boy, he was determined to escape, even though the punishments were really harsh. But it just seems, even as a teenager, as a young boy, at various important junctures in his life, Ireland played some significant role. And so when he was teaching himself to speak, he asked little white boys, what book do you use in school? How do you learn to read and write? And they told him the text was the Columbian Orator. And so Frederick, being very enterprising, shone shoes in order to get a few pennies, and he bought himself a copy. And he later said that this was some of the greatest speeches of the world, which he kept with him. He kept this book with him throughout his life. But two of the speeches that impressed him most were by Irish patriots, by Sheridan and by Arthur O'Connor. And he was really amazed that these Irish patriots also had compassion for other people who were oppressed. His next real encounter with Irish people is when he was a dock worker in Baltimore, and two Irish dock workers, he helped them, and they said, why is a fine young man like you a slave? You need to go to the north. And he wasn't sure if they were entrapping him, but that planted a seed in his mind. What does this mean, go to the north? And so he becomes determined to escape. He makes a few unsuccessful attempts, but finally, 1838, at the age of only 20, and helped by the remarkable Anna Murray, a free black woman, he escapes. He gets to New York. He changes his name to Douglas. His original surname is Bailey. And at that point, he could have gone to Canada, where he would have been safe, but he chooses to remain in the United States because he wants other people to find a pathway to freedom. But he knows he's not really free because there's a Fugitive Slave Act, and so at any stage, he could be captured and returned to his master. So he lives that sort of life. But Frederick, joins the abolitionist movement. He starts to read William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, and in 1841, he's invited to an abolitionist meeting in Nantucket, the largest ever to date. He attends, and at one point, because he is unusual, he is somebody who has escaped from enslavement, who's self-emancipated, he's called upon to speak. And he later writes that his knees were shaking, but he got up and with his usual elegance and eloquence, he told his life story, which was compelling. And one of the audience members was William Lloyd Garrison, who realizes he has a star in the making. And Garrison invited the young Frederick Douglass to become a lecturer on the abolitionist circuit. So Frederick does that, but he's so compelling that people start to say he must be a fake. He cannot be authentic. He cannot be self-educated, self-emancipated. So in 1845, Frederick writes his life story, his narrative. It's published in Boston in May 1845. He's not the first former slave to write a narrative, but it's the most popular one. And one of the things to point to in this narrative is, as was the tradition, the narrative was verified in some ways by a white abolitionist. In this case, William Lloyd Garrison writes the preface. And what, for our purposes is relevant is that in the preface, they quote Daniel O'Connell, the Irish liberator, as one of the greatest abolitionists of the day. So very clearly, Frederick Douglass is aware of this Irish emancipator. So Frederick publishes his narrative, but it quickly gets him in trouble. He names names, and he knows he's in great danger of being captured. And so his friends persuade him to travel to the United Kingdom. Again, not unusual. So he travels to Liverpool, August 1845. He stays in Liverpool for 2 days. And then what is unusual is he then goes to Dublin. And he goes to Dublin with the intention of staying just for 4 days. Some Quaker printer abolitionists in Dublin had said that they would reprint his narrative so that he would have income to live with while he was in Ireland. So he goes for 4 days, but his sense of freedom, liberation, and equality is so great that he stays for 4 months. And within 2 weeks of being in Ireland, he writes back to Garrison saying that not only does he, for the first time in his life, feel safe, but for the first time in his life, he feels equal. He feels, as the minister said, a man, not simply a colour. So being in Ireland becomes a very liberating, transformative experience for the young 27-year-old Frederick. And tonight we're gathered here because this is the 175th anniversary of Frederick meeting his great hero, Daniel O'Connell. So by the 1840s, O'Connell was probably the greatest abolitionist in the world. He'd surpassed William Wilberforce. And Daniel said he first heard of Daniel O'Connell. Frederick said he heard of Daniel O'Connell in 1838 when O'Connell refused to shake the hand of the new American ambassador in London on the grounds that he was a slave breeder. And the American ambassador challenged O'Connell to a duel, which O'Connell refused to fight. But this issue played out in the newspapers. And Frederick later said, I heard of my masters lambasting this interfering Irishman, and I knew if they hated him, that I should love him. So when Frederick was in Ireland, he really wanted to hear O'Connell. And 29th of September, he attended a repeal meeting in Dublin. Daniel had just come back from summer in County Kerry. The hall was packed, 3,000 people. And Frederick was at the back. And when Daniel sat down after he'd spoken, Frederick moved to the front. He was introduced to John O'Connell, Daniel's son. And John O'Connell said, "You must meet my father." And when Daniel met him, he said, "Wait, do not leave the hall. Hear this young man." And so Frederick was invited on stage to make an impromptu speech. And during the course of that speech, Frederick said, "What my people need is a black O'Connell." And he ended the speech with the rousing call of saying, what we have to do is agitate, agitate, agitate. And there's no evidence that the men ever communicated again or ever met again, but we know from Frederick's speeches that that meeting and his time in Ireland really impacted on him for the rest of his life. And if I could now turn to, so we can hear some of the actual words of Frederick Douglass, because on the 18th of September, I had the honour to work with Ian Gray. We were part of Culture Night in Ireland, and we recreated Frederick's footsteps in Dublin. So Ian is going to read the words of Frederick to us.
Ladies and gentlemen, I came to Dublin expecting to stay here for 4 days in order to oversee the publication of my life story. But I have now been here for a month. I escaped slavery 7 years ago, but even in the northern states of America, the so-called free states, I, as a fugitive slave, was liable to be hunted at any moment like a felon and to be hurled into the terrible jaws of slavery, doomed by an inveterate prejudice against color. I was denied the privileges and courtesies common to others in the use of the most humble means of conveyance, shut out from the cabins of steamboats, refused admissions to respectable hotels, caricatured and scorned and scuffed, mocked and maltreated with impunity by anyone, no matter how black his heart if he had white skin. But now behold a change. I have crossed 3,000 miles of perilous deep ocean. Instead of a democratic government, I am under a monarchical government. Instead of the bright blue sky of the America, I'm covered with the soft gray fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the child becomes a man. I gaze around in vain for one who will question my equal humanity, claim me as his slave, or offer me insult. But I look in vain and meet nothing here to remind me of my complexion. I find myself regarded and treated at every turn with the kindness and deference paid to white people. I've been in Dublin but a few days, when a gentleman of great respectability kindly offered to conduct me through all the public buildings of this beautiful city. And a little afterward, I found myself dining with the Lord Mayor of Dublin. I've seemed to have undergone a transformation. I lived a new life. The warm and generous corporation extended to me by the friends of my despised race, the prompt and liberal manner with which the press has rendered me their aid, the glorious enthusiasm with which thousands have flocked to hear the cruel wrongs of my downtrodden and long enslaved fellow countrymen betrayed. the deep sympathy for the slave, and the wrong abhorrence of the slaveholder. Everywhere evinced the cordiality with which members and ministers of various religious beliefs and of various shades of religious opinions have embraced me and lent me their aid. The kind hospitality constantly pre-offered to me by persons of the highest rank in society, the spirit of freedom that seems to animate all with whom I come in contact, and the entire absence of everything that looked like prejudice against me on account of my color of my skin, contrasted so strongly with my long bitter experience in the United States that I look with wonder and amazement on the transition. I can truly say I've spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country.
There's nothing more powerful than to hear his own words. And Christine, thank you for setting that up for us so nicely. If I may take this opportunity, Edna, to go to you. Your scholarship has taken on big themes in African American history and characterizations of very impactful figures. I'm thinking of Lincoln and other people. Would you mind generally locating, this is a tall order, but locating Frederick Douglass somehow in the scope or breadth of African American history more generally, and why 175 years later we're still intrigued by him, and we've so much to learn by him as a figure?
Sure. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this very important discussion this evening. But I think we need to look at Frederick Douglass as probably the preeminent abolitionist of the 19th century and the principal spokesman for the rights, not just of African Americans, but for all people who were oppressed. We need to remember that he's very much involved with the women's suffrage movement as well as abolitionism. But this man spent most of his life in trying to elevate people of color, especially, and women as well. When he comes to the North and he gets involved with William Lloyd Garrison and the American Anti-Slavery Society, he's doing so at a time when abolitionism is really intensifying. We call it militant abolitionism during this period. People aren't talking about moral suasion as much as they're talking about we need to end this heinous institution now. And so Douglass is at the forefront of that. He is so important because he's a man who had been enslaved. Garrison and white abolitionists could only talk about what they had heard about the institution. Douglass had lived it. And it didn't hurt that he was a good-looking guy, too. Very handsome. He was young, 27, when he went to Ireland, I believe. Tall, slender, with a powerful, booming voice, incredible oratorical skills. He is especially important during the years of the Civil War. He has his own newspaper before that time, but during the war, he is pressing Lincoln and the Republicans to make this war one for not just union, but for the liberation of enslaved people as well. But even after Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in '63, which is just the beginnings of true emancipation, because we know that the 13th Amendment is what actually ends slavery in the United States. But what Douglass is doing is he's pressing Lincoln not just to do something about slavery, but to do something about Black rights. So throughout the war, until 1864 at least, he's talking about making certain that the rights of Black soldiers are the same as the rights of white soldiers. And so after the war, he's doing the same thing. It is not enough for people to be freed. Freedom, the definition of freedom from Douglas's perspective, is full citizenship rights. It's not just the end of slavery, but full citizenship rights as well. And so he spends the rest of his life pushing for that, and also for pushing for the rights of women. It's interesting that in his speech at the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial to Lincoln in 1876, he uses that opportunity to really show white Americans how hypocritical they are, how the institutions that are in America really don't benefit the poor, minorities, the downtrodden. And so he spends the rest of his life attempting to convince America to make certain that all of its people are equal, not just white men primarily and women, but Black men and women as well, and white women, of course, in terms of the vote. He breaks with white women on the issue of voting, because he does believe that Black men should have the vote before women, if it has to come to that. He would have preferred that both get it at the same time. But since it looked like only Black men would be eligible for it, he felt that women could wait for the vote. And of course, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were not willing to concede that. And so they broke that relationship until later on the day that he died. He had been at a women's rights meeting, and he had come back to tell his wife about the experience, and of course collapsed and died that same day. So he's a person who's absolutely essential to 19th century, not just African-American life and African-American desires, but he's someone who's important to the entire country, because he's pushing for America to live up to its creed of equality for all people.
Do you happen to know, Edna, he's, one can say he knows the sting and the impact of enslavement firsthand. But I mean, I'm not a 19th century historian, but I know enough to know that he's ahead of his time in terms of his status on women. Do you know where that came from, and were there early female figures in his life who inspired him in that way, or can you fill that out a little bit for us?
Yeah, there were always important women in his life, starting with his mother. He didn't even know her, actually, but he remembers seeing her one time. But the fact that she traveled for miles at night to see him, he was with his grandmother at the time, and she traveled over to see him at night. And he says when he woke up, she was gone already, and he never saw her again. But his mother does have that influence in terms of him recognizing a mother's love for her child. He's got, even white women are an influence on him, because one of his first teachers clandestinely was the white woman who at the plantation where he resided and worked. And so women had always been a very important part of his life. His wife, the woman, his first wife, for instance, had an influence on him. I know we talk about the fact that she was probably illiterate and that she may not have been as intellectually curious as he was. But I think it's important to recognize that a man like Douglas could not possibly have been successful without a woman behind him encouraging him and letting him know that what he was doing was okay, even though the family was suffering, obviously, because the man traveled a lot. But she not only tolerated that, but encouraged that. So yes, women were very important in his life.
Thank you, Edna. It's fascinating. If I can move to Maurice now. Maurice, in the run-up to this event, I think you've immersed yourself a little bit more in Douglas's odyssey, his journey to Ireland. As a scholar of the African-American experience, How do you locate Douglas, his time in Ireland, or his time, you know, basically as a kind of global citizen before that kind of term was coined, if you know what I mean? Can you share some of your reflections about how, I know you've just returned from the Middle East yourself. What is the impact of Douglas globally? Can you share some reflections on that?
I'm sorry,
No
forgive
problem.
my technical backwards. I'm a scholar of the 18th century, so my wife calls me a Luddite for my backwardness. You know, Douglas came to Washington, and it's fascinating to watch in Washington now as there's a movement to take down monuments of many people. There's movements to put up monuments to Douglas, and it's for one particular reason. He's at Cedar Hill there in Washington because he did become the global citizen. You know, when he said uh, 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 those who would want freedom must strike the first blow. And that slogan was changed so many times. He who strikes the first blow for freedom, wants freedom, must strike the first blow. But it took many, many different forms. But Douglas is much more complicated, I think, in his origins. He doesn't know his father. He knows he may be of Irish extraction. The first Irish people he meet actually are slaveholders. He talks in 1836, he's working in the shipyard. And he says, the words almost exactly, 3 years before, black and white people were getting along massively. And now we are fighting. And what he meant in the shipyard in Baltimore was that there was a movement to take jobs because the white apprentices thought that the blacks, young blacks were taking their jobs. And so this became a fight. So this is his first. Then the second impression is, which Christine told us about, is of these Irish sailors who urged him to go to freedom. But what is interesting about this is that Douglas writes about them in 1842. He comes back again and writes in 1855 a different version, because each time he gains more and more respect for these Irish sailors. Now, this is not new. You remember David Walker wrote his appeal in 1828, and David Walker shipped his appeal down south by Irish sailors. So this was something that Douglas would have, of course, known about. And so he was one of the first to really internationalize this. So when he goes to Ireland, as Christine has told us, he meets Daniel O'Connell only briefly, but he's understood his statements that slavery is an unnatural condition, that it brings harms to both the black and the white. Now, O'Connell didn't invent this. This came from 18th century Enlightenment. It came from men like Anthony Bennett. It came from people like Adam Smith, who spoke about the danger of slavery to white people. But O'Connell did this in unique ways, and Douglas saw this. And when he's there, and for the first time, he is treated with basic decency by whites as he travels. And then he begins to work. And as you know, in those years, books aren't just sold on the street. You get subscriptions to books. So he got subscriptions to the books and was able to sell and reprint. Then something, and this is a story I heard as a kid, and I used to work get through school. I worked on ships, and I can remember someone telling me this. He said that Douglas was overseas in England, and that he came across a man in a ditch. And as he came across the man in the ditch, he was covered with a sheet. And he picked up the sheet and he saw that half the man's face had been bitten off. And then he found that the man was Irish. And he spoke about that. And his visitor and the white person told him, no, you don't speak about that. You speak about the plantation, you speak about facts, we will give you the philosophy. And Douglas says, no, I must fight for freedom everywhere. And this became a concept that we in America took back, that he saw the struggles of this. Now, if you go back to Martin Luther King, you remember that when Dr. King started speaking about the war in Vietnam, they said, no, boy, no, that is not your business. It is for you to speak only about black people. So you see, Douglas is one of the first to internationalize this, to tie in the plight of black people worldwide. And that's why it becomes so important now. As we look at Black Lives Matter, Douglas became a part of this international movement. You remember that in the 1880s, the Second International is Bill Kosky and those. There's this movement for international responsibilities. Douglas has seen many things. He's seen the 1848 revolutions, and he says, I expected the Hungarians, the Irish, and other people to come out more and fight against slavery. They didn't. Then he saw in 1840, he saw a ship leaving Washington, D.C., with 70 blacks on it called the Pearl. and he saw two men trading in sales, and he saw others, and he saw people of Irish descent working with those. So it was back and forth. And we cannot ever confuse this question of slavery. Slavery is based on color. While he realized that the person, he used the words of O'Connor and others like that, he said himself that that for the Irish person in America, they can be branded, and they can be branded as lesser, but they can never be branded as black. So he never forgot the extent that color and race had on him and his people. And this becomes the legacy, and because he was able to transform that. The last thing is this, his internationalism. His internationalism led him to demand that Lincoln recognize the Haitian Republic. You remember Lincoln wouldn't do it until 1862. He demanded that. He went off to Haiti, therefore became a minister council at Camp Molay. Then later on, he went to Santo Domingo. He became this international person at a time when internationalism is not the necessarily norm, but nationalism becomes the norm, and he becomes this. And so in this light, he gives to the world, to black, to white, and to many others.
Thank you, Maurice, and thank you for bringing in the American perspective in that regard, in terms of his encounters with Irish American, right? Where, when we're talking about him in Ireland, there's maybe a slightly different experience to what he experiences here. And in a moment, I think I'm going to ask Edna a little bit about that. But Christine, can I ask you, would you mind, this isn't what I planned to ask you, but I think it would be interesting what was your hook in terms of bringing you into Douglas and the Irish trip? A lot of your work has been on the famine period, and I assume it was in that context that you came across him. And is that where this all started for you?
So yeah, for many years I've been researching on the Great Hunger, the famine, which occurred in Ireland in the 1840s. And so I love the 1840s is my decade, 1848 years revolution, etc. So I love the 1840s. And at one point I was asked to write something on Daniel O'Connell. And Daniel O'Connell, you've talked about him as this great liberator, but towards the end of his life, he was increasingly conservative, increasingly Catholic. And within his movement, there was a breakaway group, Young Ireland. And I was more interested in Young Ireland. They were cultural nationalists. They included women. They were dynamic. But I was asked to write some on O'Connell, which I did. But as I did more and more research on O'Connell, I moved away from just seeing him as the great Irish liberator, the great Irish nationalist, which he was. But I saw him more as an international champion of human rights. Because as soon as he won Catholic emancipation, he started to agitate for Jewish emancipation. He agitated for the rights of Aborigines, the rights of Maoris, the rights of natives in British India, and of course, for abolition. And so I just felt that O'Connell needed to be revisited. He'd sort of fallen away from being central to Irish history. But to me, his greatest humanity, we've talked about this with Maurice about Frederick Douglass as an internationalist, was Daniel O'Connell was an internationalist. And I think what binds these two men together, and to me, it's my interest in social justice and human rights, is that they were internationalists who fought oppression wherever it existed. And that was one of the things that I was saying before that really attracted Frederick Douglass to Irish writers, and particularly to Daniel O'Connell. He said, these people, yes, they fight oppression, yes, they're patriots, but they fight oppression wherever it exists. It's not bound by border or nationality or ethnicity or color or gender. It's if there is oppression, they stand up against it. So to me, that is my interest in Frederick Douglass. So anyway, I got into Daniel O'Connell, and then I realized he'd been very influential on this young visiting so-called fugitive slave, and that sort of led me to Frederick Douglass. And this is 10 years ago. One of my great friends, Don Mullen in Dublin, said, well, Frederick was here for a short while. Why don't you transcribe his speeches? So I'm like, wouldn't that be interesting? It took me 8 years. Frederick Douglass made almost 50 speeches when he was in Ireland, most on abolition, quite a lot on temperance. He was a great temperance man. He didn't keep notes. I had to search them out in the newspapers. And this young, self-educated, self-emancipated man would speak for up to 2 hours. And like Daniel O'Connell, he would enthrall his audience. And so I just became absolutely mesmerized by this man. And just to come back to the point you asked before, at one point when Frederick's in Limerick, and you can see in those 4 months in Ireland, he really finds his own voice, his agency in a way that I think is very important. But somebody in Limerick during one of Frederick's speeches says, yeah, we understand because we Irish are slaves. And at this point, Frederick challenges that concept and he says, no, you're not. You are oppressed, but you are not slaves in that you own your own body, spirit, and soul. At any time, you can leave employment, you can leave the country. No, you are not slaves. But I think that was an important moment in helping Frederick refine the whole concept of what it meant to be oppressed, and what he feeds into his support for women's movement, etc., and his support for Haiti. And later in life, he becomes a great advocate of Irish independence. He speaks on behalf of home rule in America. So again, I think his time in Ireland is very important. And to me, it's important that we understand Ireland, because we think of Ireland, always fighting for her independence. But this shows us an aspect of Ireland fighting for other people's independence. And I think that's important to recognise as well.
That segues nicely to the next question, Edna, I wanted to ask you, because in part, in crude terms, what we're talking about in a way, on some level, is his encounters with Irish America as he had experienced them here, and then when he goes to Ireland. In particular, Edna, you have spent some time studying the African-American experience in urban environments, and I'm in particular thinking about somewhere not too far from me, a very special place for me, the African Burial Ground here in New York City. Frederick, and from what Maurice has touched on, the Irish, the Irish, bearing in mind it's not a monolithic group or whatever, but Irish Americans would have been familiar to Frederick, right, from Baltimore and from places. Can you, as an African, we spend a lot of time trying to contextualize and unpack the complexity of the African American and the Irish American relationships in urban America in the 19th century. Would you, unpack that a little bit for us based on your research, Edna?
Sure. You have two competing groups in urban America. You have the Irish, many of them recently arrived to the country, very poor, looking for jobs and housing. You have African Americans. If we're talking about the North, you've got them in places like New York and Boston, but primarily places like New York and Philadelphia. They also are looking for housing and employment. And you've got a middleman, so to speak. You have the native-born white American who is trying to pit one group against the other to the advantage of the native white American. And he's telling the newly arrived Irish that you are better than these Negroes, because they're not calling them African Americans, but you are better than these Negroes. And so you have to treat them as if you are superior to them. But at the same time, the Irish are also being abused by native-born people. And so African Americans get the sense that the Irish aren't quite on the same level as the native-born Americans. And so you've got these competing interests, both competing for housing, limited affordable housing, both competing for jobs, and they're clashing constantly. And so in areas like New York, for instance, you have there are riots that are fairly common, and not just in the North, but in the Midwest as well. In the South, you have free Black people, especially, who are so oppressed, there's not much that they can do. I mean, the riots aren't even necessary in many instances while slavery is going on, although they do occur. But you really have the rioting primarily before the Civil War in the Midwest and in the North. And certainly an example of one of the worst riots involving African Americans and Irish Americans, or people who fairly recently immigrants to America, occurs from July 13th to July 16th, 1863 in New York City, in Manhattan. And it occurs because the Conscription Act is passed. And it's after Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, making this war now for not just union, but liberation of enslaved people. And you have poor Irish people who are being drafted, and they see themselves as being oppressed because they're being told they have to go to war to help free Black people who they are already, I mean, they're not competing with the enslaved person, but they certainly are competing with African Americans in the North, and they are concerned that if freedom occurs, then all of these people who were enslaved in the South will be coming north and will be competing with them for jobs. And so what happens is it's 4 days of rioting. Approximately 120 people are killed. Most of them, however, are the rioters. There are 11 Black people who are killed. I think one actually is a child. But this just simply creates even greater animosity between the Irish and African Americans in New York and elsewhere as well. But it's about how African Americans are perceived by native-born Americans as well. You know, the phrase to sort of summarize what African American life was like during this period was segregation from cradle to grave. You know, you are separated, you're seen as inferior, you can't get adequate housing, you get the worst jobs, and what's happening is even with the worst jobs, African Americans are losing them for newly arrived, primarily Irish immigrants. So that resentment is there already. Even Douglass, and I think as much as I admire Douglass, there were some negative things about him as well in terms of how he kind of bought in to some of that attitude that native-born people were trying to develop, that animosity against the two groups of people. Douglass sometimes used Irish people, stereotypical Irish, as the brunt of jokes. You know, he would talk about how the African American man had a greater right to be, or an equal right to voting when compared to the drunken Irishman. So things like that he would say. But he goes to Ireland and he is very well received, and he is very appreciative of how he's received in Ireland. And he comes back to America and he has to deal with the same kind of racism that was there when he left. And so that does impact his thinking. He does recognize that both groups of people are oppressed, but he also sees that native-born white Americans are sort of instigating the whole thing.
The one big difference always, Edna, is that the Irish can mask their accents and change their names and hide their religion in the way that not all of them, obviously, but many did. You can't change the color of your skin, and that was the marker, right?
Right, exactly. And the problem was too, even if you were successful financially, you were not elevated in the eyes of any white Americans, because the deal was that any person, any man, woman, or child with white skin was seen as superior to any Black man, woman, or child, no matter how wealthy they were or how well educated. And Douglass certainly saw that in America. You know, he goes to Pendleton, Indiana, and he gets beat up, you know, and part of the reason, I'm sure part of it is because he was an abolitionist, but the other part is because he's African American as well. In New York, there are places where he can't go, certain restaurants, certain hotels. He can't ride the streetcar unless he's, in a different kind of setting than what the average white person would experience. He can't ride a rail car unless he's in the Jim Crow car. He's in the segregated car. So he recognizes that the life of African Americans is very different from other Americans.
Thank you for that, Edna. Maurice, can I ask you, we're so grateful to our hosts at Georgetown University for hosting this. And I believe you're a great man to talk about the history of Georgetown. But you mentioned a little bit, but can you elaborate a little bit on Douglas and his connection to Washington, D.C.? I believe he moves there in the 1870s or so, if I'm not mistaken, and I think finishes out his life there. Can you tell us a little bit about that Douglas, Washington, D.C. connection? And you're on mute.
Just one thing, just one point around what Edna was saying. You know, where the burial ground is in New York, down by 4th Street, there in 1741 was really the first great urban revolt. And I can't go into all of it, but much of it was work between the Irish sailors and others who worked together, including, and when it came down, the Dutch wanted to blame the Irish Catholics for helping stir up the Black people's struggle for freedom. And it went to a dancing master, Holt, an Irishman who was a dancing teacher, and many others. You know, Frederick Douglass does come to Washington. When he comes to Washington, it's in many ways like a patronage job. He's given a job as a U.S. Marshal. What is a U.S. Marshal? U.S. Marshal is a person who evicts people. It was a patronage job that was given to many, many Black leaders, including Georgia Douglas Johnson's husband and others who came to Washington. And it was a very high-paying job, actually, for the time. So he comes there, he works there, and then he becomes the at 2 other jobs. He becomes the counselor to Haiti and others. But as he's working in Washington, he's constantly fighting for the question of equality. But Douglass, as we're told about Connealy, he does in some ways, and maybe it's age, I don't know. He does become a little bit more reticent about the struggles of Blacks, I guess, just like O'Connor does. And he has more ambivalent feelings, especially around the poor Blacks around it, and says some statements that I probably wouldn't say. And it's because he has fought all his life. He comes to Washington. Washington is moved back and forth. He's at a period where Reconstruction has come. It is Reconstruction schools that have come. And then all of a sudden, it's all taken away. Near the end of his life. Reconstruction, 1755, 65 to 77, and then it ends right there. And the poverty comes back. People had been coming to Washington, the contraband and others, and treating with somewhat decency. And now all of this is taken away. The Reconstruction schools and everything is taken away. So Douglas views all that. So he goes into active politics, and that he raises his sons, they're Fred Jr. and Lewis. Lewis becomes one of the founders of baseball in the Black community. His other son becomes a member of the school board and other things like that. And Douglas brings another love to Washington that has a concept with the Irish, and that is his love of the fiddle. And he becomes quite a fiddler as he plays there. And in fact, he loves it so much that he raises money and sends people like Will Marion Cook off to Oberlin and other places like that. And by doing this, he established the African-American classical tradition by helping train Black classical musicians, such as, and these are people who Dvorak and others have discovered later on. So his role but his role now is taking on a more cultural form.
I apologize, folks. I got so enthralled by our conversation that I kind of forgot about the audience questions, but there's one here in particular that I would like to pose. And that is part of the thrust or purpose of the thinking behind the work we're doing today in terms of comparative Black and Irish studies, to thread it forward to the contemporary moment, to look at ways from the history to address this longer history, and I suppose in that way speak to the moment. I always say, I've been saying a lot in recent months that I wish that my research topic was less relevant today, that it's not just consigned to history books. And unfortunately, we have been reminded all too much in recent months as to, yes, things have been accomplished in terms of Frederick Douglass's day, but but my goodness, and it has put this topic on the world stage as well. Does anyone want to come in and comment on that?
Well, I think one thing that it does, it tells us the absolute responsibility of white people in America and in the world to step up in the fight against racism. You see, if you've looked, and I've been traveling life, if you've looked at all the demonstrations, if you looked in Minneapolis and everything, they've been, in many cases, black-led. But what you've seen now is young white kids taking some responsibility, taking some initiative. You've seen this act of joining together and fighting for blacks. And this is something Douglas fought for all his life. So if no other lessons are there, they are those. A blow for freedom anywhere is a blow for freedom everywhere became his colloquium, and people are seeing this. And so Black Lives Matters is taken all over. When you say in Ireland, when you say in England, when you say in cities in the Middle East, and places like that, it has tremendous influence, as it will in the United States.
And if I may, I think his legacy is that it's showing us that every human being has a responsibility to ensure that every other human being is treated with justice and equality and humanity. We lose our humanity when we sit by the wayside and watch people be abused and killed, murdered, or whatever, and we do nothing about it. And so Douglas, even with the issues that he may have had with Irish Americans, understood that we were all in the same place as human beings, and we had to make sure that everyone had the opportunity to live as full a life as possible.
And can I just add to that? Because I think we're all of an age on this panel that we predate Black Lives Matter. But when I was a teenager, I was part of the Anti-Racist League. So the struggle continues, maybe under different names and in different ways. But one thing I love about Frederick, I love many things. I know he's not perfect, but his inclusivity. And I think that's a message we should take forward. And also, his message, agitate, agitate, agitate. As he said, power concedes nothing without a struggle. If we just sit back and let it happen, it will happen. We have to be active agents. So I think that's the lesson I take from Frederick. We have to do something. If we want change, we have to be those agents of change. And working together, we are stronger.
When he visited Ireland 175 years ago, it was a very homogenous place. If Frederick Douglass arrived in Ireland today, if he was on the street, Grafton Street in Dublin, for example, it's as diverse as New York City. And one of the things I, want to be mindful of today is how what's happened in recent months has provoked conversations that are not just about the United States. Okay, there's a particular history and legacy in the United States, and there's a particular relevance today because of some of these issues. But also for us as Irish people to be very reflective about how we define the boundaries of Irishness, because it's very different to what Frederick Douglass would have experienced. And I suppose some of the work we're doing here at New York University is to challenge those conceptions about who can define themselves as Irish and who cannot. And because of some of this fraught history between Irish Americans and African Americans, in my experience, based on the oral histories I've done with Americans who are of Black and Irish ancestry, they have not felt welcome in Irish spaces because they don't look like me. And the Ireland of the future, the children are, not all of them are going to look like me. Some of them are going to look like my son, who's biracial, right? And how we are having these conversations in an Irish context and thinking about the welcome of Frederick Douglass and how that might play out on the streets of Dublin or any other place in Ireland today in terms of welcoming others in and, drawing a through line and being cognizant of our history of sending people out and how we welcome back people back into the country in this new demographic richness that we find ourselves in.
I just add maybe a note of complexity, because Frederick came to Ireland in the 1840s when the nationalist movement had revived, but there was also a very strong Protestant movement. And when he was in Dublin, people supported Garrison. When he got to the north, people were anti-Garrisonian. And Frederick negotiated that. But as someone, I lived in Belfast in the 1980s and 1990s, and Ireland in some ways wasn't homogenous. And I think the complexity of what Frederick witnessed in Ireland and how he knew how to negotiate it, I think it really, again, helped to refine and make more sophisticated his political philosophies, because he really did. He understood he understood when to talk about O'Connell, he understood when not to talk about O'Connell. So he came into Ireland in the 1840s, that was a cauldron, an Ireland that was about to undergo this lethal famine. Mm-hmm. And yet he took lessons away from it. And again, I think that's part of the greatness of this 27-year-old.
Well, that's I could stay here all evening chatting. The wonderful thing about Zoom is I feel like I'm here in my office just having this conversation with Christine and Edna and Maurice, and how rich it has been. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules for us to reflect on this important milestone in Irish and African American history. And I hope it is the beginnings of and continuation of more work that we can do to really continue these vital conversations. Thank you, Edna. Thank you, Maurice, and thank you, Christine. I believe I am now handing over to Minister Coveney and to Ambassador Mulhall. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, I will just say a few words of introduction to the Minister. I came to the knowledge of the Douglas connection with Ireland, which we're very proud of today, through my interest in Daniel O'Connell, and especially when I was in Germany and discovered what a major figure O'Connell was in Germany in the 1820s, 30s and 40s, where his renown was widespread. And even people like Goethe talked about the marvellous Daniel O'Connell. So when I went to Nyan in 2012 to speak about O'Connell at the O'Connell Summer School, I had the privilege of sharing the stage with Nettie Douglas, who, the great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass, who alerted me to the sense in which O'Connell's renown, his fame, was not restricted to the European continent, but actually had crossed the Atlantic. And the more I've read and explored Frederick Douglass's visit to Ireland, the more I realized what an extraordinary figure Daniel O'Connell was, and what a historic meeting took place between O'Connell and Douglas 175 years ago today in Dublin. And O'Connell was an Irish political titan, best known in Ireland for delivering Catholic emancipation in 1829 and for his attempts to repeal the Act of Union, and for his efforts to generate reform proposals, reform movements that would improve the lot of Irish people in the 1830s and 40s when he was a member of the Westminster Parliament. But I also have come to realize what a ferocious opponent of slavery O'Connell was. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why there was such opposition to slavery in Ireland in the 1840s, which benefited Frederick Douglass and ensured that he would be very well received all over Ireland. Wherever he travelled around the country, there was a huge enthusiastic reception for him because of the strong anti-slavery sentiment that existed throughout Ireland at that time. And it just seems to me to be hugely appropriate that on the 175th anniversary of Douglas's visit to Ireland and his meeting with the great Daniel O'Connell, that we should happen to have the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence, Simon Coveney, visiting the United States and engaging with people from the administration and Congress, and also being able to come here and contribute to this event this evening, commemorating Douglas's time in Ireland. The Minister, of course, is from the city of Cork, where Douglas spent 4 weeks. About a quarter of his time in Ireland was spent in Cork, where he was well received, and where he gave, I think, a total of 13 speeches in Cork and also in Youghal. So, and the minister, of course, is also, a minister from, or is a politician from Munster, the home province of the great Daniel O'Connell. So I just think there's a certain kind of appropriateness to the fact that the minister happens to be in Washington today on the anniversary of the meeting between Douglas and O'Connell. And that's why it gives me enormous pleasure to hand over to the minister to say a few words to bring our proceedings to a close, and also to thank everyone who helped to make this event possible. We're very pleased and delighted that Douglas's visit to Ireland is being marked in this way here today through this event. And I now hand over to Minister Simon Coveney.
Thank you, Dan. And when you have an ambassador that's as good as Dan Mulhall, he doesn't leave much to be said by the minister after an introduction. Can I just say I've had the privilege of being listening to the conversation for the last half hour or so, and it's been a real privilege to listen to people's thoughtful contributions in relation to Frederick Douglass and what drove him, his connection to Ireland, his connection to Daniel O'Connell. I was saying to we spoke earlier to Nettie Douglas, his great granddaughter, and I was saying, you know, how refreshing it was to be talking about somebody who travelled from the United States to Ireland to gain inspiration in order to come back to the US and make such an extraordinary impact. Because for so much of Irish history, we of course have seen people travelling in the other direction to do great things in the United States, and in some cases to come back home to Ireland. I remember the first time actually I became curious about Frederick Douglass. I was in a hotel in Cork City called the Imperial Hotel. It's in the, if you can call it, the sort of financial quarter in a small city in the south coast of Cork. And it's a busy hotel. And I came out of one of the rooms, and I saw a portrait of Frederick Douglass, and under it a plaque that was presented to him from a number of societies against slavery in Cork back in the mid 1840s, and it really got my curiosity going as to who this person was. And his connection with my city, Cork, and his connection with Ireland. And here we are today, recognizing 175 years since that visitation to Ireland, and celebrating the impact of an extraordinary agitator, of somebody who brought about change, of somebody who gave speeches that are still inspiring people today, despite the fact that as a child he had no formal education. Quite an extraordinary person, and agent of change a number of lifetimes ago, and still impacting on how we see exclusion, racism, relations between people today. And so I think this year it is all the more relevant, given some of the political and racial tensions in the US in recent months. And as has been said earlier, the projection of that discussion and political debate into other parts of the world, including Ireland. And I thought it was interesting to hear people question what it is to be Irish today. Certainly, the plan that the Irish government has between now and 2040 is for a population growth in the Republic of Ireland of about an extra 1 million people. And interestingly, half of that extra population will not have been born in Ireland. And the continuing multicultural nature of Irish society is certainly going to continue at pace, I hope, because it is so enriching, and is changing Ireland for the better in many ways. So for lots of reasons, I'm delighted to be in DC marking this event today, having given a speech that I think you might have heard earlier from Dublin, actually only a stone's throw away from Conciliation Hall, where Frederick Douglass met Daniel O'Connell for the first time and was hugely impressed by his oratory. So we want to and we are marking this year as a special year, marking the connection between Ireland and Frederick Douglass, Ireland and African Americans, many of whom have Irish connections in their own family stories. Some good, some not so good. And I think it's important to say that. And so what we want to do to mark this year is to offer the opportunity for more young men and women, students from minority backgrounds, maybe from disadvantaged circumstance, to be able to travel to Ireland as students. And we want to support and help to fund that. I'm delighted to say that we are partnering with the Council of International Education Exchange, and we have Jim Pillow, who's the president of CIEE, with us here today. And we are going to fund, as an extension of the Frederick Douglass Global Fellowship Program, 10 new fellowship programs to Ireland from next summer on, I think. So what we wanted to do was something practical and real that could allow others to gain inspiration from today's Ireland. Not in the same way that Frederick Douglass did 175 years ago, of course, because Ireland was a very different place in those days. And I'll just allow myself to get distracted for a second. When I was a young boy growing up in Cork City, my family fostered a number of other young children at different times when I was growing up. But when I was 5 years of age, we fostered a young Nigerian boy called Francis, who was 6 years of age. And I always remember, I remember very, very little of when I was that age, but I can remember very clearly walking hand in hand with Francis down the main street of Cork City, and the public parting as if some exotic animal was walking down the street that nobody had seen the likes of before. And it often reminds me that in the late 1970s, somebody with a different skin color simply wasn't part of Irish society in many ways in terms of experience. Now today, I take my daughters to school and I see multiple skin colors, religious and ethnic backgrounds, and a very rich and diverse society, and how it's changed in a relatively short half-lifetime since then. And so I'm sure when Frederick Douglass came to Ireland, he was seen as different in so many ways, but also was made extraordinarily welcome for that difference. And as Dan said, an Ireland at the time that had many anti-slavery societies that were anxious to listen to and support the work and the inspiration that Frederick Douglass was trying to provide. So I hope we're going to get new inspiration for some of the young people that are going to travel to Ireland, and I hope feel incredibly welcome when they do, and enjoy their time and build even further the relationship between Ireland and this extraordinary country across all backgrounds and groups of society in a very positive way. So I'll hand you over to Jim now, just to give you the short detail of how it's going to work. But to everybody on this conference, thank you for educating me on the history of my own country and its relationship with an extraordinary agent for change here in the United States, certainly Frederick Douglass's place in Irish history, despite the fact that he spent a relatively short time in Ireland, I hope will be enhanced by the celebrations and commemorations that have taken place, not just on this call, but on some of the other events that the Irish government have been supporting as well this year. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister and Ambassador, for the invitation to participate in this celebration of the 175th anniversary of the meeting and speech of Daniel O'Connell and Frederick Douglass. Our organization, the Council on International Educational Exchange, was founded 75 years ago, roughly, to help bring the world together after World War II. And the founders were faculty, very much like the faculty we heard from today, who thought the best way to build bridges and to break down barriers was to bring young people together. And so we've been at this now for almost 75 years, and we work with hundreds of universities across America and hundreds of over 136 countries. But there's no country we work more closely with than Ireland. Since our founding, we've helped over 100,000 Irish come to the US to understand our culture and way of life. And so it's a privilege for us to join you today in celebration of this momentous occasion to offer to co-sponsor with you the 4th cohort of Frederick Douglass Global Fellows, who will be chosen in February of 2021. 10 scholars will be selected from over 1,000 applicants, students of color from across America who demonstrate academic ability, academic excellence, and an appetite for social change. These are agitators of change in their communities across America. And we look forward to having them visit and come to know Daniel O'Connell's legacy, the culture of Ireland, the special people of Ireland, and to begin to build bridges in ways that very much like O'Connell influenced Douglass and Douglass influenced others. We hope these will become future influencers and agitators of change. So it's our privilege to be here today and participate in this special occasion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim.
Minister Coveney, Ambassador Mulhall, Mr. Pello, thanks for joining us for that very exciting announcement. For those of us who are on the call, you'll see in the chat function that we've shared a link to information about these Frederick Douglass fellowships. Thanks especially to the Minister and the Ambassador for rushing, I know, from the Department of State to be here with us today. We really appreciate your being here. But thanks also to our panelists and to Miriam for moderating. Professor Medford Green, Professor Jackson, Professor Connealy, this has been a fascinating conversation. We had over 500 people listening in during the course of the conversation. We had lots of questions that we were unable to get to because, in fact, the conversation itself was so scintillating. But it doesn't end today. And of course, the campaign to end racial injustice in Ireland and the US does not end with Douglass, nor in 1845. These are, as the Minister has said, as the Ambassador has said, and as everyone has said indeed, these are vital questions for our own time. The Embassy's events about Douglass, NYU's ongoing conversations about Black, Brown, and Green voices, our own focus here in Georgetown on racial justice in Ireland in the coming year, and University College Cork's series of conversations about Douglass's legacy and racial justice in Ireland today. All of these are part of a long and a much needed reckoning that will go far beyond this virtual room. And I encourage all of you to seek out, to find, to join, to take active part in these events. Or maybe what I really mean to say is that I encourage you, in the words of Frederick Douglass, to agitate, agitate, agitate. Gurmila Mahagi Akhorja, thank you so much for watching and have a very good night.